Jesus walked. Jesus
Charleston was the major point of entry for Africans brought to North America in the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1775, some 40% of enslaved Africans brought into the 13 colonies came through the port of Charleston.
And when we think of Wall Street, we think of finance, money, stock market, power, and success. However, what we don't think about is the early history often ignored by many. The history of the people who literally built Wall Street.
The first colony the Arabs founded in Africa was in the Dahlak Islands in Eritrea, and the Arabs developed a large slave trade to feed the insatiable demands of the Basra salt and soil reclamation projects around Basra in Iraq, where the delta, where the Tigris and Euphrates enters the Persian Gulf.
This is also Muhammad's time, 7th century.
Yes. This was the rise of the Arab Empire that became, an international empire. But the first 250 years of the Arab Empire saw a large, massive slave trade where they were going into East Africa and taking slaves. If you read the classic Arab scholars like Ibn Khaldun and Al-Masudi and even Ibn Battuta, they speak of these massive concentrations of African slaves in Iraq. They were called the Zanj, as in Zanzibar or in Tanzania. The Arab word for Africans was Zanj, Z-A-N-J. So there was a series of the revolts of the Zanj, or the African slaves in Iraq. And at one point, the revolts were so large that the Zanj rose up and captured the city of Basra and massacred, because apparently they were treated so brutally by their Arab slave masters. They massacred every man, woman, and child in Basra and established an African kingdom in Basra, which is the closest large city to Baghdad, which at the time was the center of Arab culture in the world.
The first great African slave revolt historically documented took place in Iraq. Known as the Zanj Revolt, it lasted from 869 to 883. Thousands of African slaves from East Africa working in the salt marshes in southern Iraq joined forces with other groups to revolt against slavery and for social changes. The Zanj rebels even established their own state with its capital called Al-Muqtada, and during 14 years seriously threatened and challenged the reign of the Abbasid Caliphate.
They spoke of, Al-Masudi in particular spoke of one plantation in the salt fields of Basra that had 50,000 African slaves there. Now, if 50,000 African slaves were living there, to get those 50,000 African slaves, they had to capture 100,000 able-bodied adults in East Africa, because out of every 2 slaves that are captured, 1 would die in transport. So, if in the Americas, if a slave life lasted 7 years, let's just say for round figures, the Africans in the slave fields of Basra lived for 10 years. That means every 10 years, 200,000 new able-bodied adults had to be captured in Africa to supply 100,000 slaves to keep the Basra plantations operating. So that means in 100 years, you're talking about 2 million African able-bodied adults were taken from East Africa to Iraq, okay? And they're treated so brutally that they regularly rose up in rebellion. Not so much in the European slave trade in Africa. But in the case of the Zanj, the African slaves in Iraq, there was subhuman bondage. And that if you read the Arab writers, the description of the African slaves, where they spoke of them having large sexual organs, of smelling bad, of being thieves, of wanting to rape their women, of being dishonest and lazy, it sounded just almost exactly like the portrayal of Africans by the white slave owners in the